Hi, everyone. I think we can go ahead and get started. People can continue trickling in. Um, Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I'm Sarah, a PhD candidate at the University of Hawaii in Manoa and GETSEA Professional Development and Graduate Council member. So thank you for taking time out of your day today to join us for the session on how to conduct research in Malaysia and Singapore. We have an exciting sharing today with experienced speakers who kindly came together to share with us on how they have been conducting their research in Malaysia and Singapore. Just a little background on this particular series of sessions. It stems from our Professional Development Council and our colleagues' experiences on whether from our respective countries or foreign researchers on navigating how to conduct research in Malaysia and Singapore, where we all received kind of varying levels of support in helping us get a sense of what to expect when doing research. And so we thought that this series of how to conduct research in Southeast Asia might be helpful for upcoming scholars and also ourselves, even people who have already been doing research in these countries. And so the format of today's webinar, we have three speakers who will share. Justin Weinstock, a PhD candidate from Berkeley, Zheng Wang, a PhD candidate from University of Albany, and Dr. Meredith Weiss, an experienced researcher from University of Albany as well. And we'll end with kind of a Q&A for 30 minutes or however much time we have. Feel free to type your questions into the chat as the speakers are sharing, or at the end, feel free to raise your hand and we'll unmute you to ask a question. And I think some of you might have noticed we are recording the session, so just informing you of that. And yeah, so feel free to also share the recording with your friends and colleagues who couldn't make it to the session. And so, yeah, without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to Justin first. Justin Weinstock is a doctoral candidate in sociocultural anthropology at UC Berkeley. For his dissertation, he conducted ethnographic fieldwork from 2023 to 2024 with the Thai and Aboriginal people Orang Asli of the Thai Malaysian borderland, and was supported by the Fulbright Lee's doctoral dissertation research abroad fellowship. Before beginning his doctoral studies in 2017 and 2018, Justin also conducted ethnographic research with captive elephants and their handlers at the National Elephant Conservation Center at Kuala Gandapa. On to you, Justin.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. As Sarah said, my name is Justin Weinstock. I'm a PhD candidate in sociocultural anthropology at UC Berkeley, and my dissertation research investigates how the Jahai and Aboriginal people, or Orang Asli, of the Thai-Malaysian borderland negotiate the presence of the geopolitical border and other boundaries in their everyday lives. From December 2022 to August 2024, I conducted ethnographic fieldwork with the Jahai communities on both sides of the border. Specifically in Malaysia, beginning in April 2023, I worked with the Jahai living in Royal Belum State Park, which abuts the northern border with Thailand, as well as with Jahai in the adjacent Temenggor region of Upper Perak State. And my research was supported by a Fulbright Hays doctoral dissertation research abroad fellowship and several grants from UC Berkeley. In terms of academic preparations, I was already fluent in Malay before beginning my doctoral studies and had studied Thai for several years at Berkeley because competency in these two languages is essential for ethnographic research with rural and indigenous communities. I also obtained extensive area studies, disciplinary and methodological training at Berkeley, and even earlier at Cornell, which prepared me for when it became time to compose research proposals for funding applications, and of course, to do the research itself. Aside from coursework, it was vital early on to identify a local counterpart, or in Malay, rakan saing, a Malaysian who has experience in my area of research, who agreed to serve as a mentor and an advisor for my work, and could offer me affiliation at a Malaysian academic institution. For me, that was Dr. Kamal Solhami Fadzil, an anthropologist of the Orang Asli at University Malaya. Dr. Kamal was, or Dr. Kamal was extremely supportive from the start in helping me gain foresight of the possibilities and challenges of the project I had proposed. Not only did he have a career's worth of experience and expertise doing ethnographic research and advocacy on behalf of the Orang Asli, particularly living within protected conservation areas, he also had a close relationship with the Jahai of Royal Balum in particular. This became important for the preliminary exploratory research I conducted in the summer of 2019, when I visited Thailand and traveled into Royal Balum in Malaysia on 3 separate times to establish contacts with the Jahai community there through Dr. Kamal's introduction. I also met Dr. Colin Nicholas at the Center for Orang Asli Concerns, who traveled with me to Balum one of those times and has become an important informal mentor for me in this project. So aside from networking with relevant organizations and my future interlocutors, thinking on the ground during this trip helped me to identify emergent research questions and themes, and become familiar with the lay of the land to anticipate practical and logistical challenges I would face later on. It was also important to make inquiries ahead of time on how to formally set up my affiliation at my Rakan Saing's institution. My application to UM's mobility program for a non-graduating research attachment was approved in about a month, just to give you a sense of timeline, but required a letter of support and paperwork from Dr. Kamal in advance, and the process of course varies from institution to institution. My advice is to start early with this process, because you'll need the letter from your Rakan Saing and a letter of acceptance from the university to apply for permits and a visa later on. The next step was to apply for permits, and all graduate students at foreign institutions, regardless of citizenship status in Malaysia, must apply for a research pass from the Economic Planning Unit. The EPU screens applications for sensitive issues and sends it out to other relevant government agencies for comment. Dr. Kamal was again very helpful in checking my proposal for any potential red flags, and your Rakan Saing, like mine, would ideally be familiar with the institutions involved in your project, even if they may not know the processes for foreign researchers to apply for permits or visas. Approval could take several months depending on how many places and institutions are involved in the research proposal you give to the EPU. The EPU determined my referral agencies to be the Department of Orang Asli Development, which is JACOA for short, and Perak State Park Corporation. But my application from the EPU itself took about 6 months to be approved. That's because it was subject to several months delay because of misunderstanding that my application required prior approval from the Access and Benefit Sharing Clearinghouse in compliance with the Nagoya Protocol. This special permit is only necessary for those whose work entails collecting biological specimens or traditional knowledge on natural resources. All it took was a phone call to the EPU to explain that, but this was after several months. All it took was a phone call to the EPU to explain that even though my field site was in a state park with a traditional community, my research was concerned with the Jahai's contemporary way of life, not their traditional knowledge or the biodiverse environment they live in itself. Therefore, an ABS permit would not be necessary. And it's a good thing, because I'm told that an ABS permit could take up to 18 months to get. After I clarified this point, my EPU application was approved within a month and a half. With the UPU's approval letter, I then applied for separate permits from the Perak State Park Corporation and the Department of Orang Asli Development, which took between 1 to 2 months each to be approved. All this to say that it's important to begin the permit application process early and to keep in regular contact with relevant officials about the status of your application to make sure that the process is running smoothly. Applying for a visa called the student pass is completely independent of the research permit process and should be made through the Education Malaysia Global Services, or EMGS. It took about a month and a half for EMGS to obtain my e-visa approval letter from immigration, which I had to present upon entering Malaysia. This letter expires in 6 months, typically, I guess, and I wasn't required to get a single entry visa because US citizens get a 90-day stamp on arrival. I'd recommend applying to EMGS 3 months in advance of your projected arrival in Malaysia. When I arrived in Malaysia in April of 2023, I had to go to UM's visa unit to have them arrange with EMGS to have immigration put a student pass in my passport. This process can take up to 1 month depending on your affiliation. I use this time to work out logistics, including transportation and living arrangements. I bought an inexpensive compact Malaysian-made car called the Perodua Myvi because public transportation in rural Perak, where I work, is limited because I would have to haul around a lot of provisions for the forest, and because I couldn't drive a rental car across the border as my research in 2 countries entailed. Although I was technically not supposed to travel outside of KL while my passport was still with immigration, I went to Grik, the town in Perak nearest to Royal Balloon, to find a house to rent as a field station and trips into the forest in Balloon. Finding accommodations in rural areas can take some time, but luckily I had a local friend who quickly introduced us to a landlord looking for tenants. I also used the time to get settled, install internet, figure out where to find everything in town, from food and other supplies to photocopy centers, et cetera, et cetera. Once I got my passport with student pass back from KL, and once I had all the necessary permits in hand, I was ready to start my ethnographic research with the Jahai and Royal Balloon. Their villages are about 1 hour ride by motorboat into the forest. I typically went for trips into the forest of about 1 to 2 weeks at a time because I needed to come out for provisions. The beginning months were mostly about strengthening my rapport, building trust, and establishing informed consent with the Jahai community. The highlight of my time quickly became my time with the community itself. Their generosity and eagerness to share their lives with me made my time a life-changing experience. That, of course, and the beauty of the rainforest and its diverse wildlife. Language posed a small challenge, as I'm not the best at code switching between 2 different colloquial forms of Malay I used in Thailand and Malaysia, compounded by the use of some Thai in Thailand and the Jahai's own language, which I was learning. I also faced some logistical and budgetary challenges in field work. The park management was accommodating in issuing me monthly entry permits, which are distinct from research permits, rather than having me apply for permits for each trip, as is normally the case. This cut down on bureaucracy, but in other respects, the park was more accustomed to having researchers in the life sciences, and thus didn't understand the methods or needs of an ethnographic study, in which my original intention was to live with the Jahai community as a participant observer of daily life. The Jahai themselves were eager to have me stay and even built me a bamboo hut in the village and would tell everyone about it, but the park's policies did not allow me to live in the village. I was required to stay in a ranger camp about 2 kilometers upriver, and the forest path to get from the camp to the village was underwater for about half of the year, making the community difficult to access without renting a boat and a guide on a daily basis, which would have been very costly. I can go into more details in the Q&A, but mostly this entailed reconciling my plans and expectations with realities on the ground and being patient and flexible in the face of these obstacles. One of the biggest challenges I faced is that Malaysian immigration doesn't offer any long-term visa status for student researchers' dependents, and my partner, who is an Indonesian national, was accompanying me. Since Indonesian citizens are only granted 30-day stamps upon arrival in Malaysia, she had to make runs to the nearest Thai border crossing or go back to Indonesia every 3 weeks or so. At the border, she was questioned a lot by Malaysian immigration officials each time upon exit and re-entry, even with a dependence visa in Thailand and letters of support from and UC Berkeley showing that she was accompanying me and had a dependent living stipend from my Fulbright Hays. Given the trouble she had to face, I decided to accompany her to the border. So in practice, it meant that I planned a fieldwork trip to Thailand every 2 to 3 months around these border runs, which punctuated my fieldwork in Malaysia. This was not an ideal long-term solution for anyone who will also have dependents accompanying them, and I'm happy to discuss this more in the Q&A. Doing research in 2 countries was a challenge in many other ways, because no matter how carefully you plan your time away from one site, you would feel like you are missing out on something big there. Going back, I do not regret doing research in 2 countries despite its challenges, but hope Malaysian immigration officers hope Malaysian immigration offers researchers and their dependents a better solution to the visa predicament going forward. I also wish I had not been so modest in the budget I proposed in my funding application to Fulbright Hays. Expenses really do add up over time, even in rural Malaysia, and especially between periodic trips across the border and hiring an authorized boat and guide to enter and leave Royal Balloon, which was extremely costly. Like me, some graduate students may be afraid to propose a realistic budget to not sound extravagant in Southeast Asia, but I'd recommend that those who are planning their research be realistic and allocate more funds than they think they will need. So that's all I have, and thank you for listening, and I'm happy to go into more details about any part of what I said in the Q&A, and I'll put my email address in the chat if anyone has follow-up questions or concerns.
Thanks so much, Justin. Yeah, a lot of things that I myself reconsider, especially the budget part of it. So, yeah, maybe should have budgeted more. Next we have Zheng Wang. Will be sharing about doing research in Malaysia and Singapore. Zheng is a PhD candidate in political science. He studies ethnic politics in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, and China's engagement strategies in Southeast Asia, state policies towards the ethnic Chinese in Southeast Asia during the Cold War. Zheng was a Wang Gongwu visiting fellow at the IC's Yusof Ishak Institute in 2022.
All right, so everyone from China. So I'm Zheng Wang, and I'm a PhD candidate in political science and University of Albany, SUNY. So so in terms of my dissertation research, I examine how ideological framing of the ethnic Chinese as communist really shaped historical changes in state policies toward the ethnic Chinese in 3 countries, in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, during the Cold War in the 1950s and 1960s. So as you can tell from the title of my dissertation, my research is quite historical in nature. In terms of my field research, so I conducted a pre-dissertation field work in the summer of 2019 in Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesian. And then I conducted my formal dissertation fieldwork, including archival research and interviews from 2020 to 2023. So in Singapore, I conducted my research in June and July in 2022, and then I went back there in April 2023 to wrap up my fieldwork there. So in Malaysia, my dissertation fieldwork lasted from November 2022 to March 2023, mostly in KL and Penang. So my research experience was kind of different. In terms of entering the field, of course, you need to apply for the permit or get the visa. So I started with EPU, same as Justin. So basically, you have basically the application process was quite straightforward. You just need to complete the application online and then wait for the EPU to announce your application results. So so these are the materials that you need to prepare for the application. So in my case, my application got rejected because my research counterpart by then was a research institute. It's not local university. So they right after I submit my application, they rejected. They asked me to find a local university to be affiliated with and then resubmit my application. So then because I knew I have friends working at University of Malaysia, so I was looking for help with my affiliation, and then I knew about this non-graduating research attachment program. So I checked with so basically it was a collaboration between Faculty of Social Science, Art and Social Science, and partner universities to provide research opportunities for postgraduate students who want to conduct research in Malaysia. So they told me that if I apply for this program, I don't need to go through the EPU application again. So then I choose to go with this program. I don't know whether other universities also have the similar program, but this is my experience. So basically, all you have to do is to first of all, you need to identify your supervisor. Basically, it has to be an expert at UM, and then you just need to complete the application and obtain an acceptance letter from the Faculty of Arts Social Science. Basically, you just need to send the following documents to this email address after you have identified your supervisor. If you don't know anyone working in that faculty, you just go through the faculty list and identify someone who could potentially supervise your research there. So and after you get this acceptance letter from FAS, you will need to complete the online application at the university level, and also you need to pay the fees. So because I was affiliated with UM for like 1 year, 12 months, so for this affiliation, so it includes student visa fees, administration fee, and also bench fee. Bench fee is a little bit expensive, right? Like it's 400 ringgit per month, depending on how many months you want to be affiliated with the faculty. One thing that I want to mention about this application process was that they told me that I had to complete the application process in my home country. So because I'm a Chinese citizen, so I had to go back to China to complete this application process. Because by then, initially they told me that as long as I, fill out the application outside Malaysia, that's fine. Because by then I was in Indonesia, and then they told me that because I'm a Chinese citizen, I had to finish all this process in China, so I had to go back to China to do all this. So if you want to apply for this program, make sure that you include all this space in your grant application, because it's kind of expensive, I think, especially if you want to stay there longer. And then all you have to do is just wait for the immigration to issue the entry visa. So basically, in my case, I waited for like roughly around 2 months to get the entry visa. So definitely think about this when you plan for your trip. And then you just need to report to the university upon arrival and get the student visa stamp on your passport. It might take another 1 or 2 weeks, and then they will give you a student card. So basically, one good thing about this student card is that you have full access to university libraries, which in my case was very helpful. So that's how you get the student visa. So in the case of Singapore, if you look at the official visa categories granted by the immigration department, I think there's no such a thing as a research permit. So in my case, what I did was that I just conducted my research under a single entry visa. I mean, you can also apply for multiple entry visa as well, but under that visa category, you can only stay in Singapore for no more than 30 days. Or you can also apply for a work permit if you get a job or a fellowship opportunity in Singapore. In my case, in my first trip to Singapore, because I got this Wang fellowship with ISIS, so they gave me this work permit, which allowed me to stay there for like around 5 months. So I managed to conduct my dissertation field while working for them under using a work permit. But normally, if you don't have a work permit, I think it should be fine if you just use a single or multiple entry visa. And if you want to stay there longer, you can just stay in Singapore for like 28 or 29 days and just leave the country. You just stay a couple of days in neighboring country and then just go back and continue your research. I think that's something that you can do as well. That's about the research permit and research visa. And then about building networks, in my experience, I actually built upon my advisor, Professor Weiss network, because when I first entered the field, I virtually didn't know anyone there. So most of the people I met or talked to when I entered the field initially, they were friends of my advisor. So then you begin to expand that network, right? By meeting with more people, talk to more local contact. In my experience, I think like having informal conversations with local scholars can be very helpful, because they might give you very good recommendations in terms of where to locate the documents you need, how to find the people you want to talk to, and sometimes they can share their personal collections with you or recommend the materials that you need to read. And attending events can also be very helpful. Like I attended a couple of like book release events, and those occasions are where you can find people that could be very helpful for your research. So in terms of the timeline, I think one key issue that I thought a lot about it was like how to strike a balance between different type of research, like interviews, archival research, observations, how much time you're going to allocate to each type of research, and even before you enter the field, you need to have a very clear idea of like how many interviews you're going to conduct, who are going to be your potential interviewees, and what type of documents you're going to collect, and where you could find these documents, right? That's why I think like a great dissertation research pre-dissertation research can be very helpful because it allows you to explore the field before you start your actual dissertation field work. In my case, a lot of people I knew, I met them in my pre-dissertation field work, and it also allowed me to locate the specific documents I need for my dissertation research. That would save you a lot of time because it takes time to know your field, to build the rapport. So if you can conduct a pre-dissertation research, then can be very helpful for your actual dissertation field work. So I actually applied for this CRAC pre-dissertation grant for my pre-dissertation fieldwork. So if you also have a plan to conduct pre-dissertation fieldwork, I also recommend you to try to apply for this grant. Then I would recommend some helpful resources based on my own experience in Malaysia and Singapore. So in the case of Malaysia, the they have a law library. They have this full collection of parliamentary records. I mean, you can also find them in the national library, but here you have full access to this record, and you can also take pictures and take notes as much as you want. So if you want to, if you conduct research, on Malaysian politics, and if you want to use that collection, I would recommend you to check out that collection, and you can also check out the data centers of political parties or think tanks. In my case, I conducted archive research and the data center of the MCA, Malaysian Chinese Association. They have a very good collection of newspaper clippings in Malay in 3 languages, in Chinese, in Malay, and in English. So that was also very helpful for my research. You can also check out the independent bookstores. Like in my case, I went to Golek Budaya a lot because there you can find a lot of biographies, autographies, and oral history publications. Or if you want to acquire a different perspective on contemporary political issues, you can also go there and check out the books there. In the case of Singapore, definitely check out the National Archives and National Libraries. In addition to the digitalized archives you can have access to on site, they also have oral history archives, newspaper collections online. It's available online. It's very easy to access. They also have a grant, a Lee Kong Chian grant, which you can apply to conduct research in Singapore. You can also check out the private paper collections and ICS library if your research is about the history of Malaysia, Singapore. And the NUS library also has a Southeast Asian collections. So in my case, I found white papers, official reports, and party documents of UMNO and the PAP there, which was very helpful for my research. So those are the some of the key resources I would recommend you to check out in Malaysia and Singapore. So in terms of the challenges I faced in my fieldwork, the first challenge I faced was when I first entered the field, I couldn't locate the archives and documents I need. So one thing I did was that I talked to a lot of local scholars because they have a better sense of where to find those documents. So I have, for example, I had lunch with a historian at and she told, so after we had some discussion about my research topic, she recommended me to check out the law library, the parliamentary records collections. And I also have friends who had access to this full collection on the history of, Malaysia Labour Party. So he allowed me to read those archives and scan pieces I need for my research. So definitely talk to local scholars, and they can also introduce you to people that they knew. So they could potentially be your interviewees as well. So another challenge was that I couldn't find proper interviewees for my research because of the nature of my research, right? A lot of people that went through that period of time, the Cold War era, some of them they are not in good healthy condition, and some of them they had already deceased. So I wasn't able to find a lot of proper interviewees. So instead, I relied more on our oral history archives. In the case of Singapore, because the National Archives had this oral history archive collection, so I actually used a lot of them in my research. And in the case of Malaysia, because I knew a friend who actually did a project on the history of the Chinese Language Society at the University of Malaysia in the 1970s, and he actually managed to interview most of the key participants involved in that event. So he actually shared all the original interview script with me. Which was very, very helpful. So if you cannot find proper interviews, just try to find the oral history archives that could complement the information you need. So I think the third challenge I faced when I conducted research in the field was how to strike a balance between collecting data and processing data in the field. Of course, you want to collect as much data as possible while you're in the field, but at the same time, I think you should also spend some time process the data, organize the data, and also analyze the data in the field so that you can identify the gap in the data collection process between what you had already collected and the data actually you need to address your question. So that utilize your time in the field more effectively. About the best part of my fieldwork in these two countries, I think, particularly in the case of Singapore, because I spent a lot of time doing archive research and national archives, I was very impressed by the fact that most of the data I need had already been digitalized and posted online. So that really provided much easier access for me to get the data I need for my research. And also, most of the people I met in Singapore and Malaysia during my fieldwork, they were very willing to share not only their opinions but also the documents or the personal collections they have. Partially because most of the people I met they were also Chinese as well, because I'm a Chinese too. So so looking back, I reflecting on my research experience in these two countries, I would have processed as much data as I could while in the field. I would also try harder to strike a balance between conducting archive research and interviews, because I spend most of the time conducting archive research, and if I had enough time, I would have spent more time doing interviews as well. And also, I would have spent more time interviewing people from different backgrounds to triangulate the data I collected, because most of the data I collected, they represented the state perspective, right? So if I had another chance to go back to the field, I would have interviewed people from different backgrounds to triangulate the validity of the data collected in my field research. Yeah, so that's about my presentation today. And if you have more questions, we can address them in the Q&A session. Thank you.
So, I think definitely your advice on processing data in the field and triangulating that integrating with people is something that I'm trying to do as I wrap up my own fieldwork now. So next up we have Professor Meredith Weiss. She's a professor of political science in the Rockefeller College of Public Affairs and Policy at the University at Albany State University of New York. And is also the inaugural director of the SUNY Campus Institutional Institute and currently a lead public chairman and U.S. Stanford Fellow. She addresses in her work mobilization, identity, and civil society, electoral politics and parties, institutional reform, and subnational governance in Southeast Asia, especially in Malaysia and Singapore. Her most recent books are The Roots of Resilience, Political Machines and Grassroots Politics in Southeast Asia, and the co-authored Money and Machines, Mobilizing for Elections in Southeast Asia.
Thanks. So it's a pleasure to be on this panel, although I have to say, I do think that especially for those who will be going off as PhD students or postdocs to do research in Malaysia and Singapore, Justin and Zheng's comments are probably going to be more helpful just because the research experience changes with seniority to some extent, less urgency of a PhD timeline, often more access to funding. You already have some networks, you've been there before, all of that. And because very specifically, the research pass process, which is mandatory if you are a PhD student, but more readily evaded if you are not. And so I definitely commend both Justin and Zheng for their really thoughtful comments and advice that they were able to give. But in terms of myself, I first arrived in Singapore first in 1994, and I've been working in and returning to both Malaysia and Singapore ever since. It's probably apparent from my physiognomy and accent that I'm a US citizen. I am not Malaysian. All of that affects my research experience and the process of getting in and out and so forth. And again, my research has been in both countries, more in Malaysia, but also consistently on Singapore and a bit and some other countries in the region. My work is in political science, verging on sociology and history to some extent, and it spans various topics, some of which are fairly politically sensitive, which has been the main concern I've had in terms of research access over time, as well as that's really shaped in some ways the ethical considerations involved. So I started off looking initially at policy advocacy, and then once what was called the Reformasi movement started in Malaysia in the mid-1990s, the intertwined development of civil society and opposition politics. I focused on, over time, on activism among segments around issues, including at different points, students and youth, queer communities, human rights, and so forth. So again, some relatively sensitive topics for Singapore and Malaysia. I've continued the work that I did for my dissertation, also on elections and political parties ever since, including issues of things like patronage and clientelism and politicians' grassroots engagement. I've looked at anti-corruption and other institutional reform efforts, at urban governance, and at a bunch of other issues. So in terms of preparation, what I do to prepare for fieldwork now is really very different from previously. So one does require, as you've heard, a research pass or visa for dissertation research, and I would never advise skipping that step for all sorts of reasons. At this point now, I usually just affiliate with an institution or I have a short-term employment pass. So I'm still there legitimately, but under a different aegis. My research visa, you heard some stories of delays and so forth. Mine took 3 tries and over a year. I was in Malaysia throughout that period, and the ultimately, though not initially helpful, Puan Munira at the EPU knew that. I mean, she called me at home in KL to let me know when she'd be able to give me my research pass. It caused something of an academic and freedom issue at the time because of the letters of support that they would request, for reviewing my application, and the fact that she acknowledged to me that the reason was politics. I was studying civil society in Southeast Asia and in Malaysia specifically. I do agree also with all the feedback about getting a university and or other institutional affiliation. That was the case for me from pre-dissertation research onwards. It's really helpful to identify a local mentor as well. My chief local mentor, somebody who was incredibly helpful throughout my dissertation work and ever since, was actually Sarah's father, Francis Lowe, then professor of political science at USM. And then in addition, of course, one needs language training. Unlike Justin, I did not come with Malay language. I studied Indonesian starting at the beginning of grad school, then continued that, and then took an advanced course in Malay at once I embarked on pre-dissertation research in Malaysia. Another thing that was really helpful for me, which I totally recommend, which accords with what you've just been hearing, is also just meeting people to the extent that you can, who can introduce you around and perhaps host you initially. My first pre-dissertation research field trip in Penang, there was a postdoc at Yale where I was doing my PhD work who knew somebody from the Netherlands where they'd, I think, done a master's together, who was then in Penang. And so he ended up, he had a spare room. He hosted me for my first summer. I was able to rent from him. He introduced me around to NGOs. So that sort of connection can be just so incredibly helpful. I think it's also really useful to get to know other grad students, and for this, GETSEA is fantastic. Groups more discipline specific, like CREG for political scientists, can also be useful, but really just even if it's in country, there are a few more people now doing research, whether from Malaysia on Malaysia or not from Malaysia on Malaysia or on Singapore and in Singapore than used to be the case, but we're still pretty sparse on the ground as opposed to, say, Indonesianists. But it's so helpful to have somebody else or multiple people with whom you can discuss things like visa procedures and progress, upcoming events that you might attend, just to have moral support from, set up a writing group and things like that. All right. So in terms of my own initial visits to Southeast Asia, I had the benefit of having started with a year as a Fulbright scholar in Singapore after my undergraduate work, and then a couple of summer trips to Malaysia and also Singapore. I was finishing some research there before my dissertation research, which was mostly in Malaysia, but a bit in Indonesia as well. Then I was overseas for a 3-year stretch. So from the second semester of my third year to the second semester of my 6th year. That was for 2 years in Malaysia and a semester in Singapore at ICES, if I recall correctly, then a semester at the ANU on this Luce Fellowship for Southeast Asianists, which was great. So if anyone from Luce is listening, that'd be a good program to reintroduce. Initially, I volunteered with different NGOs since I wanted to work on NGOs and advocacy work. What I was doing was very much behind the scenes. So the Asian financial crisis, for instance, broke out at the time. So I helped Consumers International, which is in Penang, to put together materials for workshops and so on. I helped organize the Aliran Library, those sorts of things. Mostly, I was keen to get to know the place and to meet people who I could turn to for information as interlocutors and so forth. A lot of this was also just rethinking my assumptions and reading a lot in country as opposed to from outside and then trying to extrapolate from that. For me, it was also important to absorb cultural details. So what to wear in different situations, especially since some of my work, for instance, was on Islamic politics. So how to engage, how to be taken seriously, it didn't help. And some of you in the audience may be able to relate to this. I looked really young. I was obviously female. All of those things can work to my advantage, can definitely work against my advantage as well. Just how to be taken seriously, not be harassed, all of those things. I'll come back to that latter point. Also, just really finer points of language acquisition, like terms of address, I found really tricky to absorb sometimes, especially since I learned Bahasa Indonesia, being fed that line that, oh, it's just like British and American English. It's not. Malay is really quite different, especially as Justin alluded to, different colloquial types and so forth. And I pretty much gave up on colloquialisms. It helped that I've been based throughout mostly in Penang or Kuala Lumpur. So the larger issue now really for me is not losing language skills or reverting completely to Indonesia when I do research there, just because so many speak English. All right. But then also just things like relative levels of formality within academia, when meeting politicians, when dealing with NGOs, all the aspects of hierarchy that were new to me that have really specific applications in Malaysia, especially this may not be so relevant for some forms of research, but for most it really is. Like, you don't want to insult people, however unwittingly. Yeah, you'll be given a free pass on a lot of this if you are, you know, a white American, but that's not really right. So you really want to try to learn those things, and there's no way to do that really well from afar. So for me, I was glad that I had some time to absorb some of that. I'm going to name sort of 4 challenges that arose fairly early on and remained issues, and I'll try and be quick because I know we want time for Q&A. The first, which was in many ways the smallest of these, and I only knew that I only realized how much of a challenge it had been post hoc when people told me, thought you were CIA when I first met you all those years ago. So apparently this was a big issue when I first came, that people thought I was CIA, because I'm American, so why not? And there are good reasons for those assumptions, not my research, but just, you know, the history of the US and the region. We're not going to think about what's coming up with, you know, the next administration. There are a lot of stereotypes of Americans that were, you know, I remember even when I first moved to Singapore, like Baywatch was a big issue. So like people just assumed that I was like a surfer gal, and I am so not. And I had never watched Baywatch, so I didn't really know what was going on. But so a lot of stereotypes, a lot of assumptions, really simple things like getting accustomed to Singlish and Manglish, as a, you know, just not questions of learning another language, but just colloquialisms and habits and so forth in country, so that I didn't seem quite so adamantly American. That was like one just overarching challenge initially. That was sort of small bore in some ways. A second challenge, which will mostly, though probably not exclusively apply for women, is just really so much more sexual harassment than I was used to. And that was in both Singapore and Malaysia. I remember, you know, I think it was my first week in Singapore, going to the Botanic Gardens, you know, good tourist, and just being stalked by some, you know, really kind of intimidating guy throughout. And then that would happen so much in Malaysia as well. It's not just if you're white or American, it happens to everyone. I don't know of any female researcher in the region who has not been harassed, whether they are I mean, maybe Sarah's the one who can be the exception that proves the rule, but whether they're from the region, from elsewhere, from the US, doesn't matter. And so I'm sure that happens just as much for people who are doing research in the US, but for me, this was just something I hadn't really encountered to such a stark extent in, you know, my university bubbles in country in the US. So the main advice I'd have, which was really helpful for me, was just have somebody you can tell about these incidents when they happen. Know that they probably will happen. Most are entirely harmless, but still just distressing and discomfiting. And so, you know, I had a somewhat older colleague, Malaysian, who, you know, she was kind of horrified to hear that this was happening, but also was just a good sounding board for being able to talk me through and so forth. So I would recommend that. Knowing other grad students around can be another really useful thing, especially if you don't feel comfortable discussing this with somebody from, you know, within the country, if that's an issue. Okay, the second challenge remains a challenge. And for this, the most useful advice I got was from Sarah's dad, which is what we call Francis Lowe from here on out. But that was just a really permanent state of imposter syndrome, which, you know, if you don't suffer from that, fantastic. Enjoy that. I'm happy for you, but a lot of us do. And part of this specifically was also not just as a dissertation researcher, but also beyond that point. I was doing research on Malaysian politics, on ethnic politics, on civil society activism, and so forth. And I kept coming back to this question, in part because occasionally people would pose the question to me, who are you to be doing this research? But who was I to be doing this research? So I would have as my interlocutors, you know, all these Malaysians who know all this stuff, including, you know, Francis Lowe just knows everything there is to know, it seems, about all the topics I was working on. And so for me, this remains a real consideration of what justifies my taking on this research topic rather than someone else is doing it. And so what Francis Lowe told me early on, which I remember, he probably would be horrified to know how much this has stuck with me, is that there are topics about which somebody who's employed in Malaysia, needs to maintain an academic career in Malaysia and so forth, cannot write about, or can't write without you know, a much greater risk to their own career than would be the case for me. So That's really kind of small comfort sometimes, but that has helped me with trying to figure out what my niche is and who I am to be doing this research. Apart from all the usual imposter syndrome issues of, teaching and so forth, those are for another webinar. The third challenge, which has also been an opportunity, or the fourth, and this is the final one, an opportunity but a challenge, is so much of the work that I do opens itself to a frame of activist scholarship. At the same time, I, in part because of the aforementioned imposter syndrome, feel really uncomfortable with positioning myself as someone who should be dictating anything about, whether Malaysia should have stronger human rights norms or whatever else. So there are a bunch of different issues here. One is that as a researcher, as a human, one can't escape one's own normative commitments. So just my advice is mostly to think through in advance what position you're in. If you are, for instance, like me, a white American researcher going to research in Malaysia or Singapore on issues touching on, let's say, some of the research I do now, queer rights, LGBTQ issues. So what's my position as that person, and what am I comfortable with, and what would be ethical beyond what some institutional review board or human subjects clearing board would talk about. So some of this is, what are the risks to myself in terms of not just, am I in danger? Probably not. But am I limiting my research access? Possibly. Am I comfortable with that? But more importantly, it's not just direct risks such as an IRB will ask about your interlocutors about whether they'll be jailed or something like that. Again, for most of the research I do, certainly I would hope nothing that I would write would lead to this. Probably not. But whether I might undermine a cause that is indeed local by making it seem foreign. So it could be a fairly anodyne issue to many of, human rights or worker rights or whatever else. And yet, if I'm the one who's pronouncing this country needs to do more on X, I'm claiming that issue as essentially Western by the fact of my saying so. And so really thinking through the implications of what I do. How I've tried to navigate that for myself is really positioning myself and what I'm doing as producing research and doing historical work and so forth that can empower and enable others from within country to advocate for the causes that, clearly I care about them or I wouldn't be writing about them, but at the same time, I'm not the one who should be or who rightly has the standing to be advocating in those ways. And I know that there are any number of positions on these issues among non-local researchers, but for me, this is what has been most comfortable for me. The other thing that has helped me a lot in sort of thinking through what justifies for myself my research and how I can play a role on issues that I care about is that I will present or share my research with pretty much any group or person who asks, including people I might not agree with in terms of their own perspective. So political parties from across the spectrum in Malaysia, for instance, that also I think really helps to keep me honest and accountable. If I present, some of you may be familiar with this, if I present my research on Malaysian politics in the US, chances are pretty good no one in the audience, except perhaps some Malaysian student, will have any idea whether I'm talking gibberish or actually saying things that are factually correct. So I'd rather present it in Malaysia. Everyone would be very soap on, very polite, but someone will behind the scenes let me know that, I got something wrong. All right. In terms of longer term research plans, what's worked for me or advice I might give after 30 years of this, the first would be just only 3 points. Don't burn bridges, even when you face unexpected hassles. This is part of why it's really helpful to have a network of moral support. So you take your frustration out on someone who is not in a position, again, to deny you a research pass or something else. So, however aggravated I might have felt with Juan Munira at the EPU, I tried not to let that show when she would call me or write to me at home in KL, but rather would go complain to other people. If the special branch came up to me at protest events, as they did, again, try to be polite and then go run and panic to somebody else. I'm facing an issue now of not having been able to get an employment pass for Singapore for next semester for reasons unknown. I can speculate all I want, but I am not going to, push aggressively just because I want to be able to continue to do research in Singapore and I have a backup plan. It doesn't mean I can't go to Singapore. I just can't get an employment pass, and they've made that very clear. All right. Second thing, which I have never been excellent at, is maintain your contacts. And so, I think with some amount of shame of all the people I met early in my research in Singapore initially, and then in Malaysia, with whom I just dropped contact. Some of that is my own, just introversion and so forth. Some of that is poor record keeping. Some of that is, interruptions and visits and not wanting to, assume that people will remember you. But that would have been really helpful in all sorts of ways, and also helped me to feel I could, just maintain some connections and repay some debts. And then the last thing would be really keep in mind, everyone I'm sure is aware of this, but just especially when you're thinking of this in the framework of long-term research, ethics and accuracy are of paramount importance. So, don't cut corners on your research, don't jump to assumptions, don't hide under a rock if you can get critical feedback that could be really helpful in honing the sharpness of your arguments and the accuracy of your claims. Yes, that may slow you down a bit to get that sort of feedback, but it's really essential. And then lastly, what I do differently that I haven't already mentioned. One really concrete thing, which has come up in the context of now doctoral students with whom I've worked, often from other universities, but also, or colleagues of mine I've heard from, I would have pushed harder to make sure that my dissertation committee reflected and included those with whom I worked most closely instead of just people at my university. So I was at Yale at the time, they really were deeply averse and just gave a flat no to including a non-Yale based member of my committee. And yet, I worked very closely with kind of 1.5 members of my committee. The third was just tacked on at the end. That doesn't reflect those who really contributed to my research. So, I've always felt bad about that. It's not like somebody who's on your committee gets any particular, kudos or benefit for being so, but it's just it shows respect. So if you know that you've been seeking a lot of advice from somebody who's not at your university or in your department, find a way to be able to include them would be my advice. Then, okay, maintaining language better, even when there have been stretches when I've been doing research either in other areas or more in Singapore than Malaysia, where I just need English, or when I've been mostly city-based in Malaysia, where you really have to push to use Malay as much as would be helpful. But it just makes it harder than when I go to the East Coast and have to shift to Malay and, really be able to ready on, on the at a moment's notice to do an interview in Malay or in Indonesia in Indonesian. And then I'd probably have learned Mandarin. I only speak a smattering of it, which it would be helpful to have. Lots of dialects would be, but Mandarin especially. A very specific to my research, but there's a larger lesson would be, I wish I had discovered archives earlier. I didn't. And so I spent so much time digging in secondary sources for, information on, let's say, the Malaysian Solidarity Convention, which was something in the 60s that I finally found, there's this helpful file in the British National Archives that I should have discovered, years ago. But the larger message here is be really actively promiscuous in your choice of research methods, regardless of what you've learned in your disciplinary-based courses on methods, if you've had them. And I hadn't had any of those besides quantitative at home. And then the final thing, or two final things, one would be, which again may apply more to me, having had an extremely long stretch of staying overseas. But I probably should have socialized myself more concertedly into US academia and the discipline. That may seem at odds with my take home point about methods, but it really is important if you're planning to go on the job market to take seriously what people will be looking for rather than what you would like to present. So to find some way to navigate between those two. And then lastly, and which Zheng may be able to relate to in particular, is to be more aware of the challenges of writing, especially writing in country. Do more writing along the way, and know when. You'll never know when you've had enough material and when to stop the research. But just at some point, declare that you have enough to get started. Shift your fulcrum so you're doing more writing than researching, and then fill in the gaps as you go. And I will stop there.
So much, Meredith. That was really very insightful. A lot of things that I'm thinking about as well as I'm wrapping up. Yeah, so we'll open up for questions now. I think if anyone wants to ask in person, feel free to raise your hand and I think we can let you unmute. Or put your questions in the chat if you have any.